tired.
Speaking of suspensions,
Yes.
are they useful?
Yeah. The answer to that is absolutely yes. And yet employers seem to have some form of trepidation in relying on suspensions. I mean, at the end of the day, union, non-union, you ought to be applying a progressive discipline process for discipline. And the whole point of progressive discipline is to communicate that if the poor conduct persists or the poor performance persists, you'll be subject to increasing levels of discipline. Well, if you just discipline with verbal warnings and written warnings, you're not you're not going to have enough opportunity, I think, to demonstrate more severe levels of discipline. And you could almost create a situation where you're lulling the employee into a false sense of security. If you keep giving the employee a verbal warning, written warning, or another written warning, or another written warning, you're really not escalating the discipline and signaling what you need to do as an employer. Whereas if you issue a suspension, an unpaid suspension, and the period doesn't have to exceed 3 days, it can be anywhere from 1 to 3 days, you are really going to send the message to that employee that that performance or that misconduct is absolutely unacceptable. Ideally, it's it's within your progressive discipline policy that's contained within your employee handbook. But even if it isn't, and some of the detractors say, well, if it's not in a policy, then you're effectively constructively dismissing the employee because you're telling the employee he or she can't come to work and you're not paying them. Well, that's not accurate, because if you're doing a 1 to 3 day suspension, that's hardly enough to constitute a constructive dismissal. So I think it's really something, and we see it with all our clients, it really works when you issue that suspension, and employers ought to consider the issue of suspensions.
Around?
Rugger. No, play rugby.
There's a B in my rugby. You said rugger.
Rugger. That's how you say it in Scotland. You don't say rugby, you say rugger. Come on, lassie.